So good evening, everyone. Welcome to the Institute of Gerontology 2023 Annual Lecture. I'm Wei Yang, the Director of the Institute. First, I would like to send my warm welcome to our Chair Professor, George McGinnis, and our honored speaker, Professor Thomas Scharf, who we are truly honored to have him speak here this evening. So before I hand over to George and Tom, I'll spend a few minutes just to introduce the Institute of Gerontology. Founded in 1986, Institute of Gerontology leads excellent research and teaching in critical areas in aging and gerontology. These research areas include long-term care policy, work and welfare, aging and social inclusion, intergenerational support and grandparenting, technology and aging. Our perspective is global. We strive to make a lasting impact on the lives of old people around the world. This slide shows you a selection of funded research projects in the past few years. These projects seek to answer very important research questions in the field, such as how do we build urban environments that enable old people maintain cognitive function and mental health well-being? What can we do to make London an age-friendly city? What is the impact of pension policy reform on people's psychological well-being? How are varying care systems associated with inequalities in care and well-being in later life in Europe? What are causes of inequitable access to health and long-term care services in China? How do grandparenting influence the well-being of old people? We are a multidisciplinary institute. We bring together a diverse team of researchers who are committed to advancing the field of aging research worldwide. I would like to draw your attention to a number of ongoing research projects within the Institute. Under the multi-million ESRC Center for Society and Mental Health, researchers within the Institute of Gerontology lead a key work stream which looks at the impact of pension policy on old people's physical and mental health. Recently, we collaborated with the Department of Engineering and won a 1.1 million EPSRC fund to look at how to use technology to tackle the issue of loneliness among old people. Our Inequality in Later Life projects uses survey and census data to examine ethnic inequalities in mental health and physical health, as well as socio-economic circumstances among middle-aged and older population. Recently, a researcher within the Institute just won a 3 million European Research Council grant to analyze the process and experience of claiming disability benefits in different countries in Europe. However, our work doesn't stop within the walls of academia. We strive to forge meaningful connections with policymakers, healthcare professionals, community organizations, and individuals. Our colleagues have informed policy discussions at the Department of Work and Pension, WHO, the European Commission, OECD, and governments around the world. So this slide shows you a few examples of how our research are featured in national and international media. Of course, we cannot achieve all of these without our collaborators. Some of our collaborators include Aging Research Network at King's, Institute of Psychiatry, Psychology and Neuroscience, King's Business School, King's Global Health Institute, Age UK, Age International, WHO. We believe that by working together, We can embrace the opportunities of aging, promote healthy and fulfilling lives for all, and build an inclusive society that values and empowers our old people. I hope this brief introduction gave you a bit of information of the work that we are doing in the Institute. Before I hand over to George, I would like to make a few housekeeping announcements. We are not expecting a fire alarm, but if the alarm rings, please make your way to the end of the venue. The fire exit is at the end of the auditorium. Please do remember to switch your phone off or put onto silence. The event is video recorded, so please alert to our student helpers if you do not wish to be recorded. After the lecture, there will be a reception with drinks outside the venue in the arcade. Thank you all again, and hope you will enjoy tonight's lecture. Thank you.
Wei, that's a fantastic introduction to the really valuable work of the Institute and of gerontology around the country, and a warm welcome to everyone in the audience. It's a great honour for me to be asked to join you here at King's to chair this lecture, and I just thought it's worth just reflecting on the name of the lecture, David Hobman. Who is this random person? Well, he was an energetic reformer who changed society's perception of older people and of charities. And for instance, he transformed what was then, and I always have to get this card out, the National Old People's Welfare Council, can you believe it, to become Age Concern, which in turn has become the Age UK that we know today. And his obituary in The Guardian records that he relished his recognition as a professor here at King's, and later his role as chairman of what was then the Age Concern Institute of Gerontology. So it's a fitting memory to David to welcome Professor Thomas Scharf to deliver this year's annual memorial lecture on From Exclusion to Inclusion in Later Life. So Tom is Professor of Social Gerontology in the Population Health Sciences Institute at Newcastle University and co-director of Newcastle's Centre for Ageing and Inequalities. Not content with that, he's a fellow of the Academy of Social Sciences and was until very recently president of the British Society of Gerontology. So Tom's distinguished research career has focused on issues relating to social inclusion and exclusion in later life. Working, for instance, in collaboration with colleagues at the International Longevity Centre UK, he produced a scoping review on inequalities in later life for the Centre for Ageing Better, and was vocal in raising the issues of ageism and age stereotyping during the COVID-19 pandemic. We need more voices like that. So I'm told that Tom has moved around a lot in his career. He was previously director of the Irish Centre for Social Gerontology in Galway, and has held visiting professorships in Galway, Kiel, Manchester and Vienna. And his current projects also involve collaboration with colleagues in Belgium, Finland, Spain and Sweden. Now, despite all this movement, he leads by example in ageing in place, and my spies tell me that he is among several generations of his family still living in the same street in Newcastle. You can tell me if that's still true, Tom, but that's what I say. So, Tom, a warm welcome.
Thank you, George. I do hope that that you're not overpaying your sources. I've never lived in Newcastle, but I do live in Tynemouth, very close to members of my extended family. Well, thank you so much for the introduction, and it is a genuine pleasure to be here. George has already mentioned the connection to David Hobman, which saves me the task of saying a few words about his important role in shaping ageing policy. And it is a bit daunting to be in King's College for the first time. This is the place where my mother studied back in the day, and my brother also was a student here. So the first time I'm setting foot in the university. But I know the Institute of Gerontology very well through a long-standing set of interactions, friendly relationships with colleagues working in similar fields to mine. And I couldn't really come here without paying a special tribute to Anthea Tinker, who sat quietly at the back there, who has accompanied me on my own journey in gerontology since I moved into this field in the sort of early 1990s. And it was Anthea's book on what was then called elderly people in modern society, or the elderly in modern society, that introduced me really for the first time to some key ideas about the social policy of aging. And I'm picking up on some of those ideas today. So it's really a pleasure to see Anthea here today. I hope I've got some of this right, because if I haven't, that's a good 25 years of my life wasted somewhere along the way. I hope that isn't the case. I should also remind myself not to go too far off script here. So let's get back to the lecture. So what I've done today in shaping the topic of from exclusion to inclusion in later life, a way forward, is I've abandoned the rule of 3, which usually governs academic lectures, and gone down with a rule of 2. So there are 2 broad themes to my talk. The first focuses on issues around inequalities and social exclusion, trying to make a case for policy change. So saying this is where we need to be investing our energies in order to bring about the change that we need. And the second part of the lecture then focuses on the way forward and what I see as the pressing need for a comprehensive ageing strategy in the UK. And to get us to that point, I want to say a few words about how social policy develops, how ageing policy develops, and what I see as being the key components of a progressive ageing strategy, with its focus on reducing inequalities, on reducing risks of social exclusion, and promoting well-being in later life. The orientation points for my lecture haven't really changed much over the last 20 years. I would still align myself with what is termed in research a critical perspective on ageing. This is what Chris Phillipson and Alan Walker, in an early contribution, referred to as a more value-committed approach to social gerontology, a commitment not just to understanding the social construction of ageing, but also to change it. And that really is the sort of collective sort of rallying call for gerontologists, I think, over the last number of years. I think this statement remains as important today as it was in 1987 when this particular chapter was published. I think equally important in a critical perspective on ageing is the way in which this focuses our attention on the ways in which social gerontologists conduct research. Older people are no longer seen as being somehow passive in the research process, that the research process is no longer seen as being entirely value-free, but really that older people are now increasingly involved as active participants who help us to develop our research questions, who contribute to our research studies, who help us to interpret our findings, but also to convey those findings in accessible ways into public dialogue. And according to Martha Holstein and Meredith Minkler, who argue for what they refer to as a passionate form of scholarship, they describe this type of engagement with older people as being part of a critical approach, an approach that doesn't aim for control or domination, it doesn't aim for certainty, but for the freedom to pursue questions, to challenge assumptions, to hear and respect a multitude of voices, and to take engaged critique as a long-term commitment. And for me, this underpins the type of engagement in research that has characterized my own sort of career in gerontology, but increasingly, I think, society is catching up with the research endeavor and demanding a greater level of involvement of citizens' voices in our research. What I want to do then, in moving to the sort of first part of my lecture, is to say a few words about inequalities and aging. This material is relatively well known, but remains deeply problematic and needs to be the focus for change and for concerted action. And here I'm drawing on the work that George mentioned, which was a collaboration with the International Longevity Centre UK, with Newcastle University, commissioned by Centre for Ageing Better. And in that particular review work, we looked also at the different ways in which researchers seek to explain inequalities in later life. Some of the early work was based on a political economy of aging model that emphasized the importance of poverty in old age and the way in which experiences through working life shaped people's experiences of poverty in older age. This almost morphed into a focus on the life course, on theories of life course, which emphasize ideas around cumulative advantage and disadvantage, which I'll say more about in a moment. And then more recently, we've seen the upsurge of an intersectional lens through which we can explore issues around inequalities and unequal aging, where the focus is on the combination and the cumulative impact of such characteristics as age, sexuality and gender, race and ethnicity, as well as social class. There are other ideas which feature less often in discussions about inequality, and in my work I'll be drawing most on the idea of social exclusion. So just briefly reviewing some ideas from sort of life course theory. And this is partly an argument to look at aging and not just at older people in later life, because the work of people like Dale Danifer and O'Rand and Crystal would draw attention to the way in which the same birth cohorts, people born at the same point in time, as they age, those cohorts become much more unequal. This type of focus draws attention to the influence of early life factors on outcomes in later life, looking at early life education, opportunities, participation in the labour market, health, access to services throughout adulthood, and the way in which they lead to either positive or more negative outcomes in old age. As Rand argues here, origins and destinations in the life course are linked by patterns of appreciation, depreciation, and compensation of life course capital that are highly complex and interdependent with age. The intersectional approach, I think, dovetails very neatly with this idea of the life course. It's been described as a knowledge project whose raison d'etre lies in its attentiveness to power relations and to social inequalities. And the argument here is that the same sort of facts can be interpreted in different ways depending on the social dynamics that are at play. So it's much more important to focus on the connections between age, ethnicity, social class than looking at any of those particular characteristics singly or even in unison with one other characteristic. So what we know, and there's a wealth of evidence around inequalities in later life in countries like the United Kingdom. I'm presenting relatively little evidence here. I'm just drawing on some key ideas reflected in the literature. And one of the most striking examples in a society which is progressively aging, such as the United Kingdom, is that not all groups in society benefit equally from increasing longevity. So between 1990 and 2013, there was a welcome increase in average life expectancy for men and women, an increase on average of 5.4 years. But if we dig below that type of data, the more positive results, we find that there are also worrying patterns. So that general increase in life expectancy isn't matched by a reduction in geographical inequality, certainly in male life expectancy. So across that period from 1990 to 2013, the difference in life expectancy between men living in the most affluent areas and men living in the least affluent areas remained exactly the same, a gap of 8.2 years. For women, that gap narrowed somewhat, but really by 0.3 years is not a significant increase. So we're dealing here with deep-seated inequalities that people like Michael Marmot are expert at reminding us of and drawing attention to, that the way in which disability-free life expectancy is associated with socioeconomic characteristics. As Rachel Cooper succinctly argues, people from more deprived backgrounds live shorter lives and live more of their shorter lives with disability and in poor health. We witnessed a case study in inequalities over the course of the COVID-19 pandemic, where a range of characteristics were associated with higher mortality rates, where those combined characteristics heightened the risk. Here we see differences in mortality rates based on ethnicity and sex, which shows that relatively speaking, white people with a white ethnic identity had a much better chance of survival than people from other ethnic backgrounds. So what we drew on, and I think it still applies in terms of the review that we did for Centre for Aging Better, is that the evidence powerfully points to the deep-seated and persisting nature of inequalities based on a range of key characteristics. Inequalities diminish the quality and quantity of life for key groups within society. Our evidence is very strong in terms of inequalities in physical and mental health, in healthy life expectancy, in incomes and financial security. There's a lot more work to be done around inequalities that relate to our social relationships, to the places in which we live, and also factors such as well-being. We also know relatively little still about key groups within an aging society, so we need to always pay attention to the growing diversity of an aging population. Now, in some ways, the idea of inequalities is a rather abstract idea. And this is where I find the notion of social exclusion to be much more helpful, because this allows us to move beyond the idea of discrepancies and lack of equality between key social groups to think about what this actually means for older people's lives. And in shaping this work, I think it's helpful to have a sense of what we're talking about when we refer to the idea of social exclusion. And here, Hilary Silver describes exclusion as being a multidimensional process of progressive social rupture that detaches groups and individuals from social relations and from institutions and prevents them from full participation in the normatively prescribed activities of the society in which they live. So this is the idea that exclusion represents sort of non-participation or an inability to participate in society in ways that most people would take for granted. In a major sort of European collaboration just a few years ago, supported by the Cost Association, I was part of a network that engaged over 180 researchers and policy stakeholders from 41 countries in Europe and beyond, with an older adult reference group to make sure that we remained grounded within older people's lived experiences of advantage and disadvantage. And what our aim here was to address the fragmentation in research and in policy, and to better connect our work to policymakers in the hope that we could contribute in some way to reducing exclusion of older people. And as part of this sort of major program of work, we found evidence across societies that reinforced some of the findings from earlier work that we did in the United Kingdom, which identifies these sort of key features of exclusion as being the fact that exclusion is dynamic across people's life courses, that some forms of exclusion increase as people age, so there are risks of poverty that increase as people's resources, material resources, are spent down. And that for some people, exclusion can be seen as a chronic condition, but also as a multifaceted condition, which I'll come on to in a moment. There's also the argument that exclusion in later life is rather different from exclusion at earlier stages of the life course. So this is in some ways a characteristic of the aging process, with the deterioration of health and the way in which people's social support networks diminish in quantitative and sometimes also in qualitative terms. But really importantly, and this is an argument for policy, is that older people who experience forms of exclusion have fewer opportunities to escape their exclusion than younger people do. So older people who become poor in later life might struggle to enter the labour market, to earn sufficient income to lift them out of poverty. Older people who become lonely, who are socially isolated, may struggle to access the types of help and support that would help them to alleviate their loneliness. And then, adopting an intersectional approach, it's clear that there are particular groups who are disproportionately affected by multiple forms of exclusion. People in advanced old age, people belong to some ethnic minority groups, older women, people who live alone. There are a range of characteristics associated with forms of exclusion. So this is the the relatively complex model that we adopted in our work on exclusion in later life. But this is useful because it also, for me, forms the basis for where ageing policy needs to be focused. So what I'll do is I'll just say a few words about these different dimensions of exclusion, because that then lays the foundation for policy development. So if we think about exclusion from services, amenities and mobility, it's clear that many older people experience disproportionately exclusion from the sort of digital world. The people may have limited access to health and social care services that would support them and maintain them in later life. Older people may experience a lack of access to a whole host of commercial services based upon age and the way in which those services are provided. And in many communities, there is very limited or no access to public transport that would allow people to participate fully in society. In relation to exclusion from material resources, this again takes on a number of different characteristics. Older workers, this is one of the sort of key features of the sort of COVID era, are disproportionately withdrawing from the labour market, with inevitable consequences for their incomes in old age. There are growing poverty risks faced by many older people, and the risk of persistent poverty faced by growing proportions of people who don't have sufficient material resources in early older age to support them into advanced older age. And through the cost of living crisis, our newspapers are full of evidence of people cutting back on basic items in order to make ends meet, whether that's heating, whether that's food, whether that's participation in a whole range of sort of social activities. Added into this is also the relatively poor state of much of the housing stock that is occupied by older people. There is also a focus in a substantial body of work on exclusion from social relations and on the risks of loneliness within the older population. People can also be excluded in terms of the lack of the sort of inadequacy of their social support networks. And a particular example from the sort of COVID pandemic, I think, that highlights the disproportionate risks faced by some people in terms of their social relationships is the challenges of maintaining social relationships of any quality with people living in care settings, that people's rights to accessing the support of family members were disregarded in many cases, with inevitable consequences for the quality, for how people view their social relationships. In other work, we can draw attention to a socio-cultural form of exclusion characterized by the prevalence of ageism and age discrimination. Again, this became a major feature through the pandemic, with misrepresentations of aging in later life, or highly stereotypical representations of older people as being in some way incapable of supporting themselves and looking after themselves, as being excessively vulnerable. These types of behaviours excessively other older people, separate older people out from what might be regarded as the mainstream of society, leading to their exclusion in key ways. And one of the concerns that exercised me considerably through the pandemic, but also since, is the way in which negative images and language have been used to represent and misrepresent older people in public discourse. I'm conscious of the time here. I'll draw this part of my talk to an end so I can get onto the sort of policy aspect, but we can also experience exclusion from neighbourhood and community in a whole manner of ways, with the ability to manage daily life independently being affected by such things as people's perceptions of crime and of risks of antisocial behaviour in the communities in which they live. That too many of our neighbourhoods and communities lack basic principles of age friendliness, which again limit older people's ability to participate in community life. And the final aspect of civic is exclusion from civic participation, which refers to the whole host of ways in which older people can actively contribute to society, but the ways in which older people may be disadvantaged by an inability to participate or to contribute in the ways that they would like to contribute. So this refers to the lack of engagement of older people in debates about policy making, or also the lack of respect for older people's basic rights, which connects to these discussions about people's rights living within care settings. Now, one of the important features of this sort of debate about social exclusion, why it's useful as a model, is the way in which these different domains of exclusion connect with one another and overlap. So people may experience simultaneously multiple forms of exclusion, and this greatly reduces the quality of their later lives. So what we know is that exclusion varies according to people's social circumstances, their social characteristics, and that we have very powerful evidence across a range of countries in terms of particular forms of exclusion, with gaps that can be filled by research on other types of exclusion. What I really wanted to do here, and I have to do quite briefly now though, is to move on to the policy challenge. And here I want to go back to some principles of social policy, because my sense, and I'm not sure whether this is a collective view within people assembled in the room, is that that the UK isn't adequately responding to the opportunities and challenges of demographic ageing, that we really lack a coordinated policy in this crucial area. So I want to go back to say, well, how does policy develop? What are the motivations? And where does this lead us in terms of prioritizing? So Alan Walker has described social policy as the idea of collective or state intervention in the private market to promote individual welfare. This is quite a traditional definition, but I prefer the approach of Michael Hill, which I think better reflects where we are with ageing policy in the UK today. Now, he says that the study of social policy has been defined as a study of a range of issues where matters of individual welfare are of social concern and therefore potentially of state concern. So what concerns us socially doesn't necessarily become a matter for state intervention or state response. And what we have to do as a group is to ensure that ageing, which clearly is a matter of social concern, becomes much more obviously a matter of state concern. And there are lessons to be drawn here, I think, from the way in which Michael Hill describes the historic development of social policy, not just in the UK, but in many countries. And I've really pared this down and tried to apply this to ageing. But the idea that there are risks, both material and moral, posed to society by having disadvantaged groups within our midst. So we're not on the verge of something equivalent to the Russian Revolution as a response to deep-seated poverty and inequalities, but we can pick up the fact that there are particular groups within an aging population who are very disadvantaged in terms of their low incomes, their lack of material resources, their contributions to informal social care that prevent people from participating in the labour market. We also see increasingly concerns about perceived national weakness as a way in which policy develops. If other countries are doing things better than us and are more economically competitive, there's a motivation there to do things better. And I think we can apply that also in the realm of aging, is that in the absence of a coordinated aging strategy, are we really not missing out on the benefits of having a larger population of older people who contribute in so many different ways to our economic and social well-being? And we also see altruism historically as being a key motivation for policy development. So not just about sort of doing good because older people deserve better, but also recognizing the contributions, again, that older people make and the need to pick up on some of the major challenges that older people are facing. So where are we with aging policy? Well, I tend to go back to the sort of early mid 2000s as what I think was almost becoming a sort of a golden era in aging policy, with the government's Opportunity Age document, and in particular the social exclusion unit's Sure Start to Later Life. Both of these documents started to sort of identify an approach which would respond to the deep-seated nature of inequalities that characterize aging societies. But this was in many ways a false dawn, and this is where we now struggle to think about where aging policy fits within the current policy-making agenda, because we don't really have anything that adequately followed up. That we don't have a minister for older people, we don't have a cross-departmental body that adequately reflects the broad ways in which aging affects society as a whole. So I would say that we need a much more concerted focus on taking practical measures to reduce inequalities. And here we can draw on the commitment within the United Nations Decade of Healthy Aging to prevent and to ameliorate risks of exclusion in later life. But we also need what I would describe as a whole system response that should be a core component of any aging strategy. Here I'd suggest the model of the quadruple helix. It's not especially sophisticated, but it's a fancy way of saying that this has to be a collaboration between government, business, civil society in all of its dimensions, and academia. There's also value in drawing into that model what's already in place. So we have a burgeoning age-friendly movement in the United Kingdom, but it doesn't have a national equivalent focus. It doesn't report nationally in a way that could actually transform the way in which we approach aging. We also have a number of research and innovation initiatives that would be a core component of any aging strategy. This needs to be cross-departmental, but also needs to be owned by some government body. So we don't want aging to be the sole focus of the Department of Health and Social Care. That's an important aspect of aging, but it would reduce aging to older people's health and care needs, and has a whole dynamic associated with that focus. What we need is a policy that has social justice at its core. Here, I would say that the UK should be supporting a convention on the rights of older persons. I would also see the potential here for the role of a commissioner for older people and ageing, if properly resourced and given sort of clear guidance. But what we can't afford is to separate out the generations. So when I talk about the need for concerted action, I think we also need to engage directly with younger age groups and bring them along, and to make this a commitment to the intergenerational contract in a way that supports all of us as we age, so that this isn't seen as singling out older people as being worthy of particular sets of rights. And for me, this is my sort of final slide here, the key components of an ageing strategy are ones that adequately address those different dimensions of social exclusion. Right? Focus on reducing poverty and material deprivation, on developing responses to isolation and loneliness, guaranteeing access to services and amenities, ensuring that older people have opportunities to participate in civic society, tackling ageism and age-based discrimination, and also strengthening people's connections to home and community. That is a substantial agenda if we start to get to grips with this, and it's something that none of us can do on our own. We need cross-society collaborations to get us to this point. So thank you very much for listening, and I'm looking forward to taking a few questions if there's time. Thank you.
Tom, would you like to join me? And we have some roving mics, so if anyone would like to start by posing a question, do please, and we've already got one here. And then just as the mic is reaching you, Tom, it's a fascinating sort of challenge that you've got, and I think your call for a commissioner for older people actually echoes what the Centre for Ageing Better now have put on their agenda. My own programme, I have the joy of having Helena Hercloch, the Older Persons Commissioner for Wales, who set her sort of final objective as would like to be one of 4 across the UK on there. But that business of trying to join up is very difficult. And one of the things that struck me as you were talking about is ageing just something for the Department of Health, that would lead to a very deficit view of what being old is in this world. And there are so many more departments that need to be involved in that. And I took a thread back to the very start of your talk when you talked about giving older people voice and a power in the conversation. I would just be interested in your thoughts on how in practice you need to do that.
Okay, I think that was a number of questions and reflections. I would obviously share your idea about, well, the idea that this doesn't belong just in the Department of Health and Social Care, but they should be key players in any strategy development alongside Department of Work and Pensions. But this also encompasses sort of media and culture. Every government department should be looking at ageing. And one of the advantages, I think, of the Sure Start work was that was initially located within the Social Exclusion Unit, which reached right across government departments, and I think was able to draw different threads together in a way that, for me, made a lot of sense, but also then importantly drew on the sort of voices of people who live very disadvantaged lives. And that report is punctuated by sort of evidence from research that looks at older people who are living in poverty, people experiencing forms of disadvantage, whether that's loneliness or an inability to participate in some way in society. How we do that in practical terms is a real issue, but we had better government for older people. We have the age-friendly movement, where in some cities and communities there are very active groups of older people who are underpinning that approach. So really it's about developing this at sufficient scale. But so these are collaborators within my idea of a sort of this quadruple helix approach, is that no single voice should dominate. And I'm not saying that older people should drive policy development on their own. They should have an important stake, but so too should other groups within society. And I would be reluctant for us to be ignoring the important role that youth groups and trade unions and church groups can also play in helping to shape a meaningful strategy.
That's good. So if we have a question over here, then is there someone else? There was another hand up here afterwards, so we have the second mic there. So if you ask your question, please.
Thank you. Sorry, John Telfer from the Elders Council in Newcastle and Newcastle Disability Forum. Thank you very much, Tom, for a very informative presentation. I would just ask, and it slightly relates to what you were talking about involving other groups. In my mind, you didn't really talk about people with disabilities. I appreciate that we all tend to become more disabled, in inverted commas, as we get older. But what about the people who have disabilities from earlier in their lives? How much do you feel that they need special attention, and how much do you feel that they should be encompassed in what you say your general policy?
I think that's a really helpful point to make, and I've been sort of very impressed by the work of Anne Leahy in Ireland, who's looked at disability and ageing and has identified, well, she talks about groups who are aging with disability and so through life, and then also people who acquire disabilities with age. And I think that's a really important and helpful distinction that draws attention to the sort of the value of taking a life course approach. I hesitated to suggest the need for collaboration between an ageing movement and the disability movement, because I recognise how problematic this has been over time, and how the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities can sometimes be seen as being in conflict with the idea of a Convention on the Rights of Older People. But I don't think there's a fundamental reason why we can't connect much better between the ageing movement and the disability movement to generate much more progressive type of policy making, because many of the issues exist in parallel. We need to understand how and why they differ in key ways, but adopting that life course approach and the intersectional approach gets us, I think, quite a long way along an agenda.
Because that's something that I have experienced. As you know, I am a disability consultant, and I have experienced considerable overlap between aging and disability, but at the same time, considerable differences. And it's important to remember that there are differences as well as considerable overlap. It's I think, too simplistic just to say age is another form of disability.
And wrong.
Very much.
Thank you.
Good. So if we have the second question, and then we've got another question up there. Are there any others? And I'll come to you at the top after that. Please ask your question. Gentleman at the front. Yes.
Hello. One thing that will be really useful to do to combat loneliness, and I've got some few notes on my phone, is one, it's called the Happy to Talk Bench, and I created it in Camden. There's one in Chalcott Square, one in Bathurst Village, and in the future, hopefully we're going to have one in Southend Green. And if you feel lonely, it's really useful sitting on the Happy to Talk bench. And another one which I wanted to mention is what is really lacking is the nightlife in the UK, especially if you're over 25. And that seems to be not promoted enough. And one thing that we could do that is really intergenerational that people don't talk about in the UK is doing art shows. And it would be good to get more conversations about it. And the other one to combat loneliness is the Chatty Cafe schemes. So if you go on the website, it's called the Chatty Cafe schemes. So they have a few cafes around in the UK. So if you feel lonely, go to the Chatty Cafe scheme. It's in a few cafes. And another one, what we're not talking about is what would be good to do in the future to raise an awareness about ageism is maybe to do like a mini protest, like the T-shirt strikes. And why are we really doing that in the UK? And last but not least, there's another one which is a public living room place, and you go to the website, but they have a few places in the UK, and it's called Camarados. And if you look at Camarados, they have a few in universities, libraries, you can have it in parks, etc., shopping centres. So yeah, and why aren't we doing age movement by doing a demonstration?
I would just say this is the value of community engagement and community action, because without people raising these types of issues and also developing these on-the-ground projects, there would be even greater disadvantage, even more exclusion faced by key groups within society. What I would say is we also need good evidence around what works. And sometimes some of these community initiatives are very valuable, but we have limited sort of robust evidence about whether a bench is an effective way of ameliorating somebody's loneliness. It's a great idea to have walkable cities, places to sit down, but we can't regard that as the single response to something as complex as loneliness, which takes many forms. But what's important is that these contributions all play into the development of policy, and that we also succeed in mobilizing people to engage around issues connected to aging in whatever way. So, so the idea about a cultural life after 4 o'clock for older people, or for people as they age, is absolutely of central importance. How do our cultural institutions get people out? In Manchester, there's the Band on the Wall, which is a really successful sort of nightclub type of approach aimed at older people. But there are brilliant examples of cultural engagement that reach out to older people. We just need more of it and more support for it. But thank you for your reflections.
Lovely. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to take these next two questions at the same time. So while you've got the microphone and going, could the second microphone please go up to the top? I'm ready. So please ask your question.
I wonder if you're pointing at me?
Yes, please. Yes, yeah. I was trying to remember where you were.
No problem at all. Many thanks for an informative
Please
lecture.
just introduce yourself as well.
Right. So my name is Danny, and I am a policy analyst at the United Nations Economic Commission for Europe, and an alumna. So one of the topics that we work on quite a bit at the UNECE is digitalization, e-governance, innovation, new technologies, etc. So from my side, I'd be quite interested to learn what you think the opportunities and challenges are that new technology and innovation and e-governance pose for elderly populations. and perhaps what are the mitigation techniques in terms of policy to ameliorate for the negative effects of technology and inequality amongst the elderly?
Good. So we've got a technology question first. If you want to ask your question again, let's see if there's any synergies between the two. Introduce yourself, please.
Hi, I'm Kathleen. I'm an older Londoner. My question really is about, if we want a really progressive social policy in older Londoners, in particular, where we are now, just the significance and the role of the economy as a driver for social policy, because obviously there's a lot of talk at the moment about older workers withdrawing themselves from the labour market and notions of a quiet quitters and this. And I just wondered how significant, because obviously, there will be a context for this, whatever we ask for. So how significant you think that is, the role of the driver of the economy and the need for older workers?
Good. So 2 questions in there for you, Tom.
Am I allowed to just admit to feeling a little bit exhausted already? But let's say those are really, I'm not sure whether I'll be able to properly answer the questions sort of here in the sort of time available, but it's, I might be able to pick up on that afterwards over a glass of wine, if we're allowed to have a glass of wine. On the question of the economy, I often come back to this because, often the request is to sort of cost how much would it cost to develop, all of the range of things that, I would like to see put in place to ensure that, well-being is improved in later life. And I've been sort of around the block on this a bit, and I think in the end, it doesn't come down to cost at all. These are political decisions that require a commitment to promote welfare and to achieve social justice. And money is always there for major initiatives if they're regarded as being important enough. And I think we haven't got near first base on ageing for people to say this is anything other than a drain on society's resources. However much we try to make the case for the economic contributions of older people and the value of older people within the labour market and the uncosted contributions to communities and to care, none of this seems to have any impact on the sort of on the Treasury or on the key people who make policy decisions. So I think we really have to build the case for, in a different way than trying to sort of argue in simply economic terms. Although it's important, but I think we've probably lost part of the battle if we're saying that that we need a coordinated policy that looks at ageing as more than that sort of financial burden on societies.
So I'm going to draw that to a close. Unfortunately, it's between a question and getting to the glass of wine. So I think I'm going to let the glass of wine win. I'm going to ask you to thank Tom, but also to thank Wei Yang and the whole of the Institute, and particularly the interns who've been helping out today and technology, but Tom in particular for a fabulous lecture and fielding some really quite complex questions. So thank you very much. It's been a fascinating